all over, darling, and now you are going to die.
In an era rife with cartoon censorship, they managed to air a Fantastic Four episode that adapted the Malice storyline, costume and all. Saturday morning cartoons used to be wild. The episode Worlds Within Worlds was from the second season of the Fantastic Four animated series, which first began airing in 1994, which was also the same year that the Corman Fantastic Four film was not released. You can, however, watch all of it online.
I had such a unbearable hatred for you, Lee. For turning me into this.
Now, the 90s animated series would be 26 episodes overall. It would also change production animation companies in between seasons 1 and 2. While the first season focused more on classic stories by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the second season dove more into the John Byrne era. And the series can get a little lost in terms of the lexicon of 90s animated cartoon history. That happens a decent amount to the Marvel shows that aren't Spider-Man or the X-Men, but there were more. Iron Man, the Hulk, Silver Surfer, and of course, the Fantastic Four. This episode has the task of condensing all of the Malice arc into one episode, so at least 5 issues. As a result, there are some changes made by necessity, and they're fascinating to compare. You can contrast what worked, what didn't work, where there's some strengths, some weaknesses, and where things don't make that much of a difference. This arc contained the infamous Reed slaps Sue moment, as well as just everything Malice. So they have a lot to get to and some decisions to make as to how they're going to handle it. We recently did a whole video on Sue Storm as Malice, not just the 80s story, but the 90s comeback and beyond. And we only got to touch on this episode very briefly, but I wanted to come back to it. The series in general doesn't get that much attention, and it's fun to talk about. But if you want to know even more about Malice and some more in-depth details as to that specific storyline, because we're going to go over it, but not do as many line reads as we did there, then I have the link below, or you can click it over there. Woe betide the day when they move the link from over there. I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and more Malice. I tried to do Malice-inspired eye makeup. It didn't entirely happen. It's something. The episode we're going to be looking at is the 5th of the second season and the 18th overall. It was directed by Myrna Bushman and is written by David Ehrman, with the story by Steve Granat and Sin Clark. Now, the episode, as mentioned, has to do some finessing. While the time Sue is first Malice in the comics is issues 280 and 281, both written and drawn by John Byrne, with inks by Jerry Ordway and colors by Glynis Oliver, it's pulling on some elements seeded in earlier issues. And the climax, or end result, the getting revenge on the Psycho Man part, takes place from 282 to 284. And that occurs when Sue is no longer Malice. There's a bunch of reordering and crunching that happens, while there are other moments that are ripped directly from the comic pages. So first, let me get to Cliff Notes, or kinda Cliff Notes, the story that this is coming from, the comic book version. So what happened during this arc? The Hate Monger, this version being a creation of the Psycho Man, not the original Hate Monger, had been stirring up feelings of biases and prejudice between the sexes, races, wherever he could. By issue 280, this had blown up, and the city descends into a full-blown race riot and other types of rioting. This allows the Psycho Man using the Hate Monger to approach his true target, who is Sue Storm. At the time, the Invisible Girl. Using the Hate Monger, who transforms to a version of Reed, he's able to take some of her latent feelings of frustration and rage and manipulate them, bring them more to the fore, give her a costume, and create this alter ego of Malice. But Malice is born of feelings that Sue has inside. They've just been forced to the surface very aggressively and hence are easier to manipulate. They're amplified far beyond what they would normally be. Her mission, should she choose to accept it, which he does, is to destroy the Fantastic Four, with a special focus on Reed. Now, the reason that the Psycho Man is doing this is because of the overpopulation in Subatomica, which is where the Psycho Man comes from. He wants to clear out the Macroverse to have space to come and conquer. But he's clashed with the Fantastic Four several times before, and so needs them out of the way. Sue is identified as the strongest member of the Fantastic Four by Reed in issue 181, and that's why she's chosen. After Reed slaps Sue out of it by overloading the programming with the very concerns triggering her, Sue wants vengeance, and she insists that Reed take her to get it. While Concern a little freaked out, after Sue likens the incident with Malice to being sexually assaulted on a psychic level, he is more willing to help her with her mission, which entails going down to the Microverse to confront the Psycho Man, and her once more having to confront her fears. And the Psycho Man once more gets into her head and really pushes them around, plays with them. Reed's able to save her, and she does defeat him by turning his technology against him, seemingly shattering his mind. Also, the Psycho Man, he got better. At the end of this arc, she rejects the name of Invisible Girl and starts going by Invisible Woman, which is a significant moment for the character. While oftentimes boiled down to the evil Sue story, that was just part of it. There was much more going on, it had layers. So how does this episode tackle all this? So it starts off with Reed having discovered a mysterious new element. It's purple, you know that's never good. But before he can fully explain to an unimpressed Sue, he is whisked away for date night under the guise of cheering up Johnny, cause Crystal left. Inhumans things from past episodes. Right away, there are some notable differences. Key among them is that Ben Grimm, the Thing, is here. While this may have been adapting Byrne's stories, they didn't take the lineup. However, it works out because She-Hulk in some ways occupied the tank position on the team, which is what's necessary for the fight when Malice is first seen. Now, Ben in this series often provides comic relief, and sometimes it's dialed pretty high up into the realm of almost silly.
I got lots better uses for Stretcho's gizmo than making purple jello. Namely, corn popping.
Which for some lands, because this was meant to be a children's cartoon airing on Saturday morning, while others find it frustrating and felt that it took away from the tone. And by others, I mean some Marvel creators. The amount of humor added to this series was something that particularly rankled writer and editor Tom DeFalco. He was the Fantastic Four writer at the time, and also the writer who had reintroduced Malice, which already happened by the time this episode aired. He took time out of an issue to insert Ant-Man making fun of it. This in issue 396. Look, Ben, look, I've never seen anything so horrible, so downright repulsive. What is it, Scott? What are you talking about? It's this new animated series that I stumbled across. The one that's supposed to be based on your old adventures. Have you seen what they did to you? Oh man. I know the team was desperate for money a few months back, but this is almost as bad as the crummy comic book they publish about you guys. What's next? Action figures? Play sets? I never thought I'd live to see the day when the ever-loving Thing became a plush doll. Forget about being attacked by your old supervillains. You'll be destroyed by the ratings. Poor Ben. He has enough going on. Leave him alone, Scott. This is played off as a joke inside of the issue, but it is pretty pointed. There is a way to read this as tongue-in-cheek, but it goes pretty hard, which is a pretty bold thing to put into a location where the people who are going to recognize what's going on are most likely more internal than external. Tom DeFalco had been editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics in 1994, but he was also fired that year, and by 396, the editor-in-chief was Bob Harris. But DeFalco would have been editor-in-chief when the writing process began. It's not because of that, it's just that happens to be how the timing worked out, or at least doesn't seem to be because of that. He does talk about quite candidly in an interview with the comic book historians. It's very interesting. I'll link it down below. Now, as for the Thing in the episode itself, he finds himself attacked. This after he's moved Reed's goop, as he's named it, out into a separate containment area so he can use that area to make popcorn.
Please, go away.
The Thing is forced to confront the fear he has of himself by the Psycho Man, which is himself as a monster. The Psycho Man is there looking for the element. Since there's no time, the episode entirely cuts out the whole hate-monger character, as well as the manipulation of New York on a grander scale. It shrinks it down to it just being something that's going to impact the team themselves. So you get to see the impact of his manipulations on them and Alicia.
What's going on?
Now, while the Psycho Man did state that he was pulling on Ben's fear, this episode isn't going to really highlight or foreground if the feelings that Sue is expressing are really deep concerns for her. It takes it more on the surface level. These are just errant frustrations, things that are just kind of being drawn out, but maybe don't need to be looked at too deeply. Perhaps?
Poor Reed. It must be so trying to have to explain everything to your backward little wife.
Hopefully, because otherwise there are some questions that need to be asked about Reed and Sue after the exchange that they had.
Sarcasm is hardly called for, especially from a girl who moves her lips when reading the Times.
Hey!
Nobody has any chill in this episode. The scene the show is used to explain that the particles themselves in the element Reed found can trigger this effect, and that the wrong hands, if targeted, could lead to something very bad. This is being used in lieu of the whole pamphlets with these molecules on them spreading hate around the entire city, but it's the same kind of mechanism at play.
Affects our thinking?
And our emotions.
Now, Sue needs to still be sent off on her own so that she can be taken over, captured, and then manipulated. And so they do this by having her leave with Alicia to go get some air and just calm down after everything that's been going on. Alicia is not handling all the drama. Now, because the hate monger isn't there, it's Psycho Man who takes on Reed's appearance and comes just grabs Sue and tells her they gotta go, stuff is going on. Now, like the comic, the transformation of Sue happens off panel. And unlike in that story where she bumps into the She-Hulk randomly while all of the rioting is going on, in this, she calls Ben directly, asking him to bring the element, or the goop, as he's dubbed it. This leads to one of the segments that has some strong recreation elements, even though it's happening with the Thing rather than the She-Hulk. Also, this episode goes so hard here.
Aw, poor little thingy, out of breath.
This is why some people call it the Dommy Mommy episode. The costume is doing half the work, but the voice work and lines do the rest.
Take a high touch.
That's a good little superhero.
Sue takes out the Thing the same way she took out the She-Hulk and the Hulk in the comics by creating a force field around the head. Then they can't breathe. And Sue's not done. She wants to take out the rest of her family, and they have the same face reveal, only this time she doesn't have a mullet. People tend to make fun of the mullet from the original story, but it was 1985. Mullets were in. There was a period when mullets were the hotness. They also had a bit of a comeback in the early 2020s, so you never know. Surprise fashion mullets, they could get you. At this point in the episode is where things really start to pivot. Ben didn't notice that this was Sue, despite the fact that there were several clues to indicate it. In all fairness, the She-Hulk didn't really either. But they have to use Reed's tech to find out, which leads to a very awkward joke.
Spike collar, red cape? Reminds me, Mother's Day is coming up soon.
Some of the jokes land, others you can see why some might have been salty. Now Reed realizes what has happened and decides that they need to go rescue Sue. So this story does not place as much emphasis on Sue's inner workings or agency as the comic book one does, but also Sue is going to go so hard later on, even more so than the comic story. It's gonna be a lot. What this shift means, aside from the changing in subject positioning for Sue, is that the defeating of Psycho Man, the climax, is going to happen while Sue is still Malice, and that Reed is going to have to confront her in the infamous Reed defeats her with a chauvinism encounter in the microverse. Now it's because the team go down with Reed, Ben, and Johnny that sometimes when you look this up, you'll see some wikis or the like that will claim that's also adapting parts of the Fantastic Four issue 76 and 77. And interestingly enough, not issue 75, which is where the title of the episode comes from. However, in those issues, 76 and 77, they're going down to the microverse to look for Silver Surfer, and Sue's not with them because she's pregnant. She's actually supposed to deliver the baby very soon. However, outside of the lineup, there's not really much taken from those issues, minus it being the first time that they go down the Reducto craft. Reed also calls them the first Micronauts. The plot for this part of the episode mostly comes from 282 through 284. Now, Sue and Reed didn't have children in this series, so they have to alter some of the lines later about Sue feeling Reed expects her dominant function to be that of a mother. The series was planning on having a pregnancy plot in the 3rd season, but it was canceled. Now, in the episode, the three are quickly captured by the Psycho Man, and they're placed inside the same tubes as in the comic, and the torture that Sue undergoes in those issues is transferred over to Johnny. Now, like in the comic, Reed melts himself to get out of the tubes they've been kept in, and he confronts the Psycho Man. Reed is able to free the others, overpower the Psycho Man, and that means it's time for the confrontation with Malice. It's what we've all been waiting for. Drum roll.
Looking for me, dear
Susan!
Correction, Malice.
And as mentioned, Sue is particularly cold and brutal in this encounter, and it really changes some of the tone of what's going on. Even though at other moments it's line for line, but just the increase, the ramping up, it adds something to the proceedings.
Susan Richards was a pathetic creature. Someone to be ignored at worst, patronized at best.
In the comics, she's taking on Reed and Johnny, and Daredevil is there because he just is. Hi, Matt. She deals with her brother by giving him a force field push to the chest, and that knocks him out. This after having extinguished his flames. And her first attack against Reed is the same as in the comic, where she manages to force him off of her when he's trying to form this big stretch ball around her. But now we have extra things to do. Ben is there, unlike in the comic, and so she crushes him into this small little blocks, and he makes this comment about how his organs are being compressed. She pushes Johnny up to the ceiling. She's able to use one of the rocks on the ground, manipulate it up, and then she's also crushing his organs. And then she turns her sights on Reed.
It's all over, darling.
What she's doing is that she's created a force field inside his body to, you guessed it, crush his organs. Malice will just demolish your organs. She's gonna crush them into a pulp. It's her specialty. Everything about this is going so hard. The three are really going through it. And that works to the scenario's advantage and is one of the strongest points of the episode in terms of adaptation. In the original story, while Sue had handily defeated Reed and Johnny, she's also not actively crushing them. It doesn't feel as though they're in quite the same level of immediate danger. And as a result, it makes Reed's actions come across as calculated, but also colder, which completely aligns with the type of character that he is. He's not one given to panic. He's one to assess and proceed with what he views as the most logical solution, most of the time. Of course, there are exceptions. But because that makes it seem as though the words and actions that he uses in the comic come to him quite easily, which for some adds a dubious layer to the proceedings. It doesn't have quite the same impact, pun intended, that it's meant to. Whereas while that same calculation is present in the episode, he even says some of the same type of lines that he has a plan.
You got any brainstorm stuck? Just
one.
There's also this immediate danger of her being moments away from killing all 3 of them. Also, this episode had a time limit for when they could get out of the microverse. They had half an hour or they were going to be trapped there forever. And Reed had already stated that he was not leaving without Sue. So there's a lot of imminent stakes, and that gives Reed's words more of a this is a last-ditch effort type of feel.
You never could carry your weight in this group.
That's a lie.
Susan, I said shut up!
Which is supposed to be present in the original story, but it doesn't entirely come through because, again, they aren't being actively menaced at that moment. She could turn on them, yes, but it's not quite the same. And also the riots are happening off in the distance. So they're not providing the same type of pressure because you're not seeing them on panel. Instead, it has to be more intellectual type of tension, which depending upon how much the reader is identifying or not with the story, they will or won't apply. Also in the episode, he doesn't slap her. The crescendo is instead telling her to shut up.
Go ahead, hate me, you weak, silly, spineless.
And it really does work, as is the case as she's increasing the pressure on his organs, and so he's having a harder time getting the words out, and so he sounds more desperate and also more genuinely upset and frustrated. And it makes the scene feel more tense because they're both emotional. But in the comic, he's acting with almost a kind of coldness. It places it in a position where some may have room to consider, weren't there other solutions that could have been used? Did it have to go up to that level? Now, one interesting discussion that came up in the Malice video in the comments was some people pondering why, for some, the slap feels different than, say, Sue taking out Johnny in the very aggressive way that she did. The question for some, to sum up, was why was the slap different? What makes one controversial for some while the other isn't? Some felt that that's Sue being let off the hook for her actions, while Reed is getting flack for saving the day. And that's an interesting position to examine and explore, so let's discuss it briefly. Because the episode also provides a nice backdrop and contrast to showcasing how the same scene can have a very different energy if you only swap a few things. Aside from different subject positionings that a viewer or reader could come into, and then that will impact how they assess the scenario, one thing to consider is the types of expected violence in comics. There's a certain kind of comic book logic about what types of fights and actions you're going to see, especially when certain characters have powers. It's less shocking to see people using their powers even against their allies, especially in a scenario one has been turned against the others for whatever the reason. Even non-powered action has a certain cadence to it. It's fairly common to see. However, other types of violence fall more into the purview of what one would expect to see in the real world. And so there can be a bit of a layer or a breaking of something that happens when one encounters an action that seems to be either straddling or crossing that line. And sometimes the real world context can override what's occurring inside the comic. And even with the context of the issue itself, for some, a man slapping his wife is just one of those moments. Some also pondered, why does it matter that she's his wife? She's really messing them up. She's out of control. You're out of control, you get the hand. All is fair when dealing with a possession type scenario. For some, that will track. For others, regardless of what's happening, she's still his wife, and that should be taken into consideration, if from nothing else than from a narrative perspective. Part of the angst when this occurs on teams can come from the interpersonal relationships at play, and the closer the relationship, the more to play with. Another thing is that her actions while they're taking out the team, they're not placing them in too much danger. They're saying that she's taking them out, but you're not seeing it in the same way that you do in, say, the episode. And actually seeing that ever-present danger, it balances the level of action that Reed takes against her. And even there, he doesn't go to the same level. So it's just interesting to compare and contrast.
You know what we need here is the world's best marriage counselor.
For me personally, it's just fascinating to explore the different ways that changes can really alter how a scene comes off, or different reasons why a scene may land more for some than for others. Some feel that the slap makes perfect sense, others don't. Now that you've seen two versions, one where he does and one where he doesn't, what do you think? Now, also unlike the original story, Sue pretends to still be in the Psycho Man's thrall, so Reed doesn't get the immediate "I did the right thing" reassurance, so there's also a tension there. But at least he still has his organs. This Sue was terrifying. With the scenario going on here, it would have been more understandable if he had slapped her. I'd slap someone if they were crushing my organs. Now, Sue does get her vengeance on the Psycho Man, turning his hate ray on him. Also in this episode, the reason he wanted to capture the team was to make them his fear police, so that they could help him control the denizens of the microverse. However, he's instead consumed by hate. Reed and Sue all over each other all the time in this series. They also in this explain more concisely why he chose the method that he chose.
I forced Sue's hatred beyond her means to hold it inside. The psychic explosion freed her from Psycho Man's control.
Now, with little time to spare, they flee the microverse, leaving a gaping power vacuum. Freeing the people down there. Can Sue keep the costume? Reed wants to know, asking for a friend. The friend is him.
Although you do look fetching in black. Johnny, take the controls.
I'm all over it. Cool.
You know, for someone that had to condense elements of 5 issues, and more if you think about also talking about the microverse and Psycho Man, they had to do all of the Malice arc. For everything going on, this is pretty solid. Worlds Within Worlds is a decent outing in terms of this series. It doesn't have the same depth as the stories it's based on, but it adds a camp factor that's kind of fun, and it's amazing that the costume made it past the censors. They covered the belly, so it's fine. She's totally not a dominatrix. The episode is definitely moving at a fair clip because it has so much to do, but the original stories move fairly fast as well. And by eliminating a lot of the overarching elements, it does feel more like a one-and-done event. It does play off more like your standard, a team member turns evil, rather than a moment of struggle that leads to a claim of a new identity, but it's not a bad episode. It really wouldn't have had time to add those layers and dive into them anyway, and that's not really the type of show that this was. It seemed more like it just wanted to be a way to introduce new viewers or younger readers, just fans, to seeing these things animated. It just wants to be an entertaining show for kids. The fact that it keeps the psychic disturbance more generic works the episode's advantage. It makes it come across less like Reed and Sue have some serious issues, and more like these are just the collective manipulations that are impacting the whole team. It also feeds more into the logic of why Reed chooses the path he does to defeat Malice. It's like most of the series okay. Some fun moments, some weaker ones, some very memorable ones. Since the episodes in this series were adaptations, it's always interesting to go back and look at this series from that standpoint. And also to come back and look at it with the benefit of distance and time in the wake of other adaptations and where the team has gone over all the years and just reevaluate how this series was. The Fantastic Four is my favorite team, so I'm always happy to have the chance to discuss them. It's funny, in this episode, Reed never outright states that Sue is the strongest member like he does in the comic story, but he doesn't have to. The organ crushing. But I've gone on for long enough, and I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think of this episode? What do you think of this arc? How do you feel about how it adapted it? What do you think of the moments that it had to tackle and how it did? Can you believe that they managed to air this episode with that costume? Are you just playing the heck out of the Marvel Rival skin? Share all your thoughts down below. While you're down there, please do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the bell notification so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking some time today to spend discussing comics and comic adjacent things with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.